Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic that I know a lot of you have been asking about, and it's been in the headlines quite a bit lately. The rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses, really since that Hamas attack on Israel back in October.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, no doubt. A lot of layers to unpack.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be using a recent report as our guide, a guide to kind of peel back those layers. This report comes from the Republican staff of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce.
Right. And it's important to state up front that this report represents the findings of the Republican staff, not the bipartisan committee as a whole.
Very important distinction. Now, this report hones in on how a number of prominent universities have responded, or in some cases, I guess you could say, fail to respond to incidents of anti-Semitism. We're talking about schools like Harvard, Columbia, Northwestern, UCLA.
Yeah, big names, big reputations. And that's part of what makes this so concerning, right? I mean, these are institutions that are supposed to be, leading the way in terms of intellectual discourse and fostering inclusive environments.
Right. And yet, this report paints a pretty disturbing picture. It really suggests that some universities might be prioritizing, appeasing certain vocal groups over protecting the safety and well-being of Jewish students.
Yeah. Let's break it down. And I think a good place to start is with the legal landscape, because I think a lot of people get confused about what's protected speech on campus versus what crosses the line into hate speech or harassment.
Right.
How do we parse that out?
Yeah, it's definitely nuanced. But the foundation, I would say, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin.
Okay. So how does that apply to Jewish students who are facing anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so the Department of Education has clarified that Title VI protection extends to religion when it's intrinsically linked to shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. So in the case of Jewish students, they are indeed protected under Title VI.
Got it. But then there's that whole free speech debate, right? We always hear about the importance of free speech on college campuses, especially when it comes to controversial or unpopular viewpoints.
Absolutely.
So how do those two things coexist?
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, robust debate is crucial in an academic setting, but there are limits, right?
Yeah.
The First Amendment doesn't protect everything. For example, incitement, fighting words, true threats. Those are not protected forms of speech.
So even if someone says something incredibly offensive or hateful, as long as it doesn't fall into one of those very specific categories, universities often feel that their hands are tied.
That's often the argument we hear.
Yeah.
And the report acknowledges those legal constraints, of course. But it also points to another law, the Jean-Clary Act, which requires universities to report crime statistics, including hate crimes.
And they're alleging that some universities have downplayed or maybe even mishandled the reporting of anti-Semitic incidents, potentially violating the Clery Act.
That's one of their claims. And this gets to, I think, a bigger point. Even within the existing legal framework, they argue that universities could be doing much, much more to protect Jewish students.
Okay. So we've got the legal backdrop. Now let's dive into the report's findings. The first one that really jumped out at me was what they call university leadership failures. And it seems like a lot of university leaders just avoided explicitly condemning Hamas's attack on Israel.
Yeah, and the report suggests this reticence stemmed from a fear of alienating pro-Palestinian students and faculty. And they use Harvard as, I guess you could say, a prime example, dissecting that now infamous October 9th statement from Harvard leadership that failed to condemn Hamas.
Right. There was so much controversy over that statement. It felt like a real turning point.
Yeah, and the report really delves into that behind-the-scenes decision-making process using internal emails and draft revisions. And it's pretty damning. It reveals that Harvard leadership deliberately chose not to condemn Hamas, despite early drafts of the statement, including such language.
It's hard to imagine being a Jewish student at Harvard in that moment, seeing your university fail to condemn a terrorist attack that, directly impacted so many in your community.
Absolutely. And the report highlights how many Israeli and Jewish students at Harvard had personal connections to those affected by the attacks. It was a deeply personal issue for them.
Then there was all the debate around the phrasing, specifically using the war in Israel and Gaza. Many felt that created a false equivalency between Hamas and Israel.
That was a major criticism leveled at the statement. And despite pushback from faculty and alumni, Harvard leadership ultimately chose to keep that language.
And, senior fellow Benny Prisker, she was highly critical of that October 9th statement, called it massively inappropriate in an interview. And she also took issue with President Gay's apparent reluctance to label the phrase "from the river to the sea" as anti-Semitic, even though it's, widely understood as a call for the elimination of Israel.
Right.
So Harvard's response to the Hamas attack was far from perfect, to say the least. But the report doesn't stop there. They also scrutinize how other universities handled this surge in anti-Semitism on their campuses.
Right.
And I think a good example of that is Northwestern.
Yeah, let's take Northwestern. The report argues that President Schill completely mishandled a situation involving a pro-Palestinian encampment on campus that was demanding the university divest from Israel.
Okay. And it all kind of boils down to who he chose to include and exclude from the negotiating table, right?
Exactly. Schill opted to exclude Jewish members of his own advisory committee on anti-Semitism from those negotiations with the encampment organizers.
Instead, he brings in two professors, one of whom was a vocal BDS advocate, and the other, Professor Kedaili, whose communications ended up being a focal point in the report.
Yeah.
What happened there?
The report lays out a series of emails and text messages that suggests Cayley was actively using his position to advance that pro-BDS agenda and even strategizing with the encampment on how to pressure the university's board of trustees.
And to make matters worse, the report shows that Provost Kathleen Haggerty was texting Cayley, expressing support for his efforts and even for a boycott of Sabra Hummus.
Right.
It really gives this impression of university leadership taking sides.
Yeah, the entire episode really raises serious questions about impartiality and whether Northwestern was truly committed to representing the interests of all its students, including those Jewish students who felt increasingly marginalized and unsafe.
Right. And then the agreement that was ultimately reached with the encampment was also controversial, especially the language around hiring a rabbi.
Right. Right. The wording was so vague, and it led to a lot of concerns that Northwestern had actually agreed to hire an anti-Zionist rabbi, even though President Schill denied that was the case. But then encampment organizers seemed to interpret it differently, which led to more confusion and distrust.
Okay. So we've got Harvard, we've got Northwestern. Now let's move on to Columbia University, where student demands were escalating rapidly in the aftermath of the Hamas attack. What were they asking for?
Right. The report details how students at Columbia were pushing for a number of things, including divestment from Israel. They also openly supported professors who had publicly defended Hamas, which created a very, very tense atmosphere on campus.
And how did Columbia respond to these demands?
They offered to consider divestment from companies deemed complicit in international law violations, which the report alleges would disproportionately affect companies tied to Israel. It was a response that many saw as caving to pressure and potentially discriminatory.
So not exactly a profile encouraged from Columbia's leadership either.
No.
But things got even more disturbing at UCLA. What happened there?
That's right. The report describes a so-called checkpoint system that was set up at a pro-Palestinian encampment on the UCLA campus. Jewish students allege that they were forced to denounce Israel in order to gain access to certain areas of campus.
I mean, that's incredibly disturbing. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, not a university campus in the United States.
It was a deeply troubling situation.
Yeah.
And a federal judge actually ruled that UCLA had allowed this illegal checkpoint system to operate, violating the rights of those Jewish students.
Wow. And the report criticizes UCLA leadership for their inaction as the encampment became a focal point for violence and harassment.
Yeah. Instead of enforcing their own policies and ensuring the safety of all students, the report claims that UCLA leadership prioritized monitoring the situation, which many saw as a passive and inadequate response.
So we've seen some pretty egregious examples of university leadership failures, but the report goes deeper, exploring not just the initial responses to the Hamas attack, but also the disciplinary actions, or lack thereof, that followed these incidents.
Right.
And that's where we really start to see this tension between free speech principles and the university's obligations to protect their students from harassment and discrimination.
Right. It's a tough balancing act, for sure. But it seems like in many cases, the scales were tipped in favor of protecting those who were engaging in hateful or disruptive behavior, often at the expense of Jewish students. And that's a core argument of this report, that universities are failing to meet their responsibility to create a safe and inclusive learning environment for all students, including Jewish students who are increasingly feeling targeted and vulnerable.
All right, so let's take a closer look at some of these specific cases where disciplinary action was either absent or perceived as inadequate. And I want to start with Columbia again. The report highlights what they call the skunk spray incident, where anti-Israel activists falsely accused Israeli students of a chemical attack during a protest.
Right.
I remember this. This was all over the news and social media.
Right. The police investigated and found no evidence to support the claim. Turned out to be completely fabricated. But Colombia was incredibly slow to correct the narrative. And in the meantime, those Israeli students were subjected to intense harassment and online abuse.
It's like they were being punished for something they didn't even do.
Right. And to add insult to injury, the report shows that the Jewish students involved in the skunk spray incident were actually disciplined more harshly than those who disrupted the campus and made threatening statements.
So much for even-handedness.
Right.
The report also discusses a referendum at Columbia on ending the dual-degree program with Tel Aviv University. And even though President Shafik personally opposed removing Zionists from campus, she refused to issue a public statement in support of the program.
Yeah, again, it's a case where leadership seemed to shy away from taking a clear and decisive stance in the face of pressure, leaving many Jewish students feeling unsupported and vulnerable.
Okay, so now the report shifts its focus to the University of Pennsylvania, where a student stole and burned an Israeli flag, even celebrated that October 7th attack, and received virtually no punishment.
Yeah. The student received what's called a suspension not imposed sanction, essentially a slap on the wrist.
And what's even more shocking is that the student was a foreign national, yet Penn didn't even revoke their visa. They got to stay on campus and continue their studies as if nothing had happened.
Right. And then there was the incident where students disrupted a Board of Trustees meeting, forcing it to adjourn prematurely. Again, those responsible receive minimal consequences for their actions.
It creates this impression that there's no real accountability for this kind of behavior.
And that perception is only reinforced by the next case study, Rutgers University. The report found a startling double standard at Rutgers, where Jewish students were actually disciplined for speaking out against antisemitism, while those engaging in anti-Semitic acts received little to no punishment.
It's almost unbelievable. You get punished for calling out hate, but the haters get a free pass.
The report details several specific instances of this disparity, including a student who encouraged the murder of an Israeli student on social media and received only a one-semester suspension.
And they were allowed to stay on campus until their suspension began, so they were basically rewarded for inciting violence.
And then there's the case of the student who was reprimanded for leading a disruption of a town hall where anti-Semitic chants were directed at Jewish students. It's completely backwards.
It's like they're protecting the perpetrators instead of the victims.
Right.
The report also shares this story of a Jewish student who was sanctioned for posting online about an anti-Semitic presentation in class.
Right.
And even more egregious is the case of the Jewish law student who spoke out against anti-Semitic classmates. And he was falsely accused of defamation and ultimately felt so pressured that he had to transfer schools.
Right.
It's heartbreaking that a student would be forced to leave their chosen institution because they dared to speak out against hate.
It is.
These cases paint a very troubling picture of how anti-Semitism is being handled, or rather mishandled, at some universities. And the report doesn't let Harvard off the hook either.
No.
Right? They circle back to Harvard to point out their failure to discipline students who occupied University Hall, despite initial statements that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated.
Right. It appears that pressure from radical faculty members played a role in pushing for leniency for those students, arguing against any form of punishment.
And that brings us to the report's third key finding, the role of radical faculty and university governance.
Right. The report argues that radical faculty played a significant role in shielding students from consequences for their actions. And this gets into, I think, the complex interplay of academic freedom and faculty governance.
Those are important principles to uphold, but the report suggests that in some cases, those principles are being weaponized to create an environment where universities prioritize appeasing radical elements over protecting vulnerable students, particularly Jewish students.
Right. It's a difficult and sensitive issue to unpack, but the report makes the case that there's a real problem here and that it needs to be addressed.
So let's unpack it. Let's take a closer look at some of the specific examples cited in the report where the actions or inactions of faculty members and university governance structures contributed to this perceived lack of accountability for anti-Semitism. And let's start with Columbia again, because they provide a really stark illustration of how faculty influence can shape university policies and responses to these types of incidents.
Okay.
So what happened at Columbia?
Well, remember that interim policy for safe demonstrations that Columbia touted to Congress, they basically abandoned it after pressure from the University Senate.
Wait, the same Senate that seemed to be protecting the students involved in the Hamilton Hall takeover?
The very same. The Senate pushed for weaker disciplinary measures and favored what they call restorative justice approaches, which often involve facilitated dialogues and apologies instead of, traditional punishments.
And that's where some critics say things go wrong, because restorative justice may not be sufficient to deter future bad behavior.
Exactly. Some argue that it sends the message that there are no real consequences for hate speech or disruptive actions.
Right. And the report digs even deeper, sharing some pretty revealing private communications from Columbia stakeholders.
Right, we're talking about high-level folks. We're talking about the chair emeritus and current co-chair of the Board of Trustees, deans, prominent faculty. They expressed serious concern and even disdain for what they saw as the Senate's radicalism.
So it wasn't just a few disgruntled voices. It seems like there was real unease among some key players at Columbia about the direction the university was heading in.
Right.
And the report specifically calls out Janine Darmiento, the University Senate Executive Committee chair. It paints this picture of her consistently supporting anti-Semitic activists, but failing to advocate for Jewish students facing harassment.
Right.
That's a pretty damning accusation, and it really feeds into this perception of a double standard at play.
Yeah.
And Harvard isn't off the hook either. After that encampment, the faculty council demanded leniency for the students who were disciplined,
Right.
and the administration caved, shielding those students from any real consequences.
That's right. It reinforces this notion that at both Columbia and Harvard, radical faculty members hold significant sway and are using that influence to protect students who engage in anti-Semitic behavior.
It's a disturbing trend, and it raises some fundamental questions about who's really in charge at these universities and whether they're truly committed to protecting all their students.
Right. And that's where we need to delve deeper into the human stories behind the headlines. Because these aren't just abstract legal debates or political footballs. We're talking about real students whose lives and educations are being impacted by this rise in anti-Semitism.
And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive, the human cost of this crisis and what it means for the future of higher education.
Join us as we continue to unpack this critical issue and search for solutions that can create a more just and inclusive campus environment for all.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the weeds, with all the legal stuff and the specific incidents. But at the end of the day, we're talking about human beings, right?
Right.
Real students who are being targeted and harassed just because they're Jewish.
And this report really brings that home, doesn't it? It puts faces and stories to the issue. We hear from Jewish students who are afraid to walk across campus, who are getting death threats online, who feel like their university doesn't have their back. Exactly. And it's not just students, it's alumni who are heartbroken to see their alma mater failing to uphold those values of tolerance and inclusivity that they thought it stood for.
This report focuses on what universities are doing wrong, but what can they do right? What would a solution even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that we all need to be grappling with, because it's not enough to just, point fingers and call out bad behavior. We need to be thinking about how to create real and lasting change.
Okay, so let's brainstorm here. What are some concrete steps that universities could take to address anti-Semitism on their campuses?
Well, first and foremost, it starts with leadership, right? University presidents, boards, they need to be vocal and unequivocal in condemning anti-Semitism. They need to make it crystal clear that this type of hate and bigotry has no place on their campus.
And it can't just be lip service, right?
Yeah.
They need to back up their words with actions.
Absolutely. It's about putting in place strong policies and procedures for addressing these anti-Semitic incidents. It's about providing training for faculty and staff so they can recognize and respond to anti-Semitism when they see it.
And it's about creating a culture of accountability, where there are real consequences for those who engage in hate speech or harassment.
Exactly. And it's not about stifling free speech. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe and respected, and where everyone has the opportunity to learn and thrive.
That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually change a campus culture, especially when you have things like academic freedom and faculty governance to contend with?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but I think it starts with recognizing that this is a collective responsibility. It's not just on the administration or the faculty or the students. It's on all of us to work together to create a more inclusive and welcoming campus environment.
So what can students do? I mean, they're the ones on the front lines facing this hate every day.
Students have a lot of power. You know,
Yeah.
they can organize, they can speak out, they can demand accountability from their administrations, they can create, student-led initiatives to promote interfaith dialogue and understanding.
And they can challenge hateful rhetoric whenever they encounter it, whether it's in the classroom, in the dorm, or online.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the importance of allyship. It can't just be Jewish students fighting this battle alone. Non-Jewish students need to stand up for their Jewish classmates and call out anti-Semitism whenever they see it.
Silence is complicity, right? If you see something, say something.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in speaking out against hate and bigotry, in all its forms.
This deep dive has been pretty eye-opening, hasn't it? It's clear that anti-Semitism on campus is a complex problem with no easy answers.
It is, but I think the most important takeaway is that this is a problem we can't ignore. The future of higher education, and really our society as a whole, depends on our willingness to confront it.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step?
That's the question we should all be asking ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
What can you do to make a difference? Whether it's on campus, in your community, or online, every voice counts in this fight.
This report focuses on universities, but, the problem extends far beyond those campus walls. It's up to all of us to be vigilant, to educate ourselves, and to challenge anti-Semitism wherever we encounter it.
Yeah, the fight against hate is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
But I believe that together we can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
Until next time, keep asking the hard questions and keep fighting for a better future.
And to leave you with one final thought for today, this report has highlighted a lot of what's going wrong. But what would a truly effective and comprehensive approach to combating anti-Semitism on campus look like? What are those innovative solutions and proactive strategies that could make a real difference?
That's a question we should all be pondering. It's going to require a multi-pronged approach. Stronger policies, better training, more resources for Jewish student groups, and a campus-wide commitment to fostering that culture of understanding and respect.
It's going to require courage. Courage from university leaders to stand up to hate even when it's unpopular. Courage from students to speak out against injustice. Courage from all of us to create a world where anti-Semitism is no longer tolerated.
It's a challenge, but it's one that we must rise to for the sake of our students, for the sake of our universities, and for the sake of our future.
It's easy to get caught up in the specifics of a report like this, the legal arguments, the individual cases, but we can't lose sight of the bigger picture here, right? The human impact of this rising tide of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. We're talking about real people's lives, students who are feeling increasingly marginalized, unsafe, on campuses that really they're supposed to be sanctuaries of learning and growth.
Yeah, and it's not just about feeling uncomfortable or unwelcome, it's about real fear. Fear for their safety, fear for their future.
Right. The report shares some heartbreaking stories from Jewish students who've been subjected to, harassment, intimidation, even death threats.
It's chilling to read those accounts, and it really underscores the urgency of this issue. This isn't some abstract debate. It's about real people being targeted simply because of their identity.
Right, and it's about the erosion of trust in these institutions that are supposed to protect and empower all their students.
Yeah, because if Jewish students don't feel safe on campus, if they feel like their university isn't taking their concerns seriously, then what does that say about the state of higher education?
It raises some fundamental questions about the values and priorities of these institutions. And it's not just about Jewish students, right? It's about creating a campus climate where all students feel valued, respected, and safe to express their identities and their beliefs.
This report focuses on universities, but as we've discussed, the problem of anti-Semitism extends far beyond those campus walls. It's a societal issue that we all need to be grappling with.
Absolutely, and it's an issue that's becoming increasingly visible and virulent. We're seeing a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, not just on college campuses, but in our communities, online, even in our political discourse.
So what can we do about it? What are the solutions, both on campus and in the wider world?
Well, it's going to require a multifaceted approach, but I think education is key. We need to educate ourselves about the history and the manifestations of anti-Semitism so we can recognize it and call it out whenever we encounter it.
And we need to teach the next generation about tolerance, empathy, and the importance of respecting diversity.
Absolutely. It's about fostering a culture of understanding where differences are celebrated rather than feared or demonized.
But it's also about accountability, right? We need to make it clear that anti-Semitism is not acceptable and that there will be consequences for those who engage in it.
Yeah, and those consequences, they can range from, educational interventions to disciplinary actions to even legal prosecution, depending on the severity of the offense.
It's about sending a clear message. Hate has no place in our society.
Right. And it's about supporting those who have been targeted by anti-Semitism, providing them with resources and a platform to share their stories.
Because silence is complicity, right? If we don't speak up, then we're part of the problem.
Exactly. It's up to all of us to be vigilant, to challenge hate wherever we see it, and to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued.
That's a powerful message, and one that we hope resonates with our listeners. This deep dive has been eye-opening and at times deeply unsettling.
Yeah, but it's also been a call to action. We can't just sit back and let this hate fester. We need to be proactive in combating it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. This report focused on the problems, but what about the potential solutions? What could a truly effective and comprehensive approach to combating anti-Semitism on campus look like?
That's a question we should all be pondering. It's going to require creativity, collaboration, and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones.
Yeah, it's going to require us to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and to work together to build a better future for all.
Thank you for joining us on this important journey. We hope this deep dive has sparked some meaningful conversations and inspired you to take action.
Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the problem, we can start to work towards a solution.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a more just and equitable world.
Until next time.